Hello and welcome to the show that gives you an insight into the hottest issues of the day. You're watching The Big Picture. In what could be seen as a tacit admission by the ruling party of its inability to stick to the reform agenda, Rural Development Minister Jairam Ramesh has urged the government to cut fuel subsidies and revisit the decision on opening up the retail sector to foreign investment. In a hard-hitting interview, Ramesh said that the time for pussyfooting is over. Dismissing the charge that the Congress party was wary of taking unpopular decision, Ramesh contended that the party would fully back the government in such a case. The government has been under intense pressure by all quarters to step up the pedal on the reform process, and barely 24 hours after the parliament session was over, petrol was hiked by 7 rupees and 50 paisa. But despite the ballooning fuel subsidies, the government hasn't gathered the political wherewithal to hike diesel and kerosene prices, with Oil Minister Jaipal Reddy ruling out any such hike for the time being. The total fuel subsidy, which is about 1,90,000 crore, is double the government's budget for rural development and higher than the country's defence budget, according to the figures quoted by the minister. Petrol has been a deregulated fuel since 2010, and oil companies have had the freedom to determine prices, but the power to decide on the prices of diesel, kerosene and cooking gas is still vested with an empowered group of ministers. Tonight on The Big Picture, the question we ask is simple. Are increasing subsidies, especially fuel subsidies, akin to wasteful expenditure? And joining me on the show tonight will be Tapan, senior leader of the CPI-M. Also joining me will be Nalin S. Kohli from the BJP, and Shankar Aiyar has come to the show and will be joining us as well. I'd like to start the show with Tapan Sen, if I could. Tapanda, coming on the heels of the petrol hike, we see a senior minister in the government saying that government has to cut subsidies and that's the only way out. Do you agree with that point of view?
You see, government, on behalf of government, if anybody speaks, he takes the government's brief. And this government brief is for somebody else, not on behalf of the people of the country. So naturally, they have to take the brief of the government. And since government has decided to make such a steep hike in the petroleum price, naturally, since they are in government, they have to support it. But the fact remains that they are talking so much about subsidy. Actually, has the government at all given any subsidy on petroleum? If you see, they are claiming that their subsidy bill is 1,90,000 crore. But from the same petroleum account, the government is extracting from the same people 2.25 lakh crore in this year in the form of taxes. Right. Every rupee of petroleum price, 47 to 48% is the tax component. So it is nothing but a white lie if somebody talks about giving subsidy on fuel to the people of the country.
Right.
Rather, the people of the country is subsidizing the government of India on petroleum tax account.
Right.
And rather, the government is subsidizing the major private sector oil barons.
Right.
Through myriad tax concessions.
Right, Tapanda.
On the same account.
Tapanda, if I could get Shankar Aiyar in on the discussion. Welcome to the show, Mr. Aiyar. First of all, immediately after the petrol hike, the government, especially a minister, has said, he suggested a roadmap that be chalked out for phasing it out as the needy are not really being benefited. His words, not mine. Does Jairam Ramesh have the right idea about cutting subsidies? And I'm not talking about just the fuel subsidies, but subsidies across the board.
Jairam Ramesh, as usual, is wrong. And I'd like to remind this audience that he was the advisor to the finance minister who deregulated all petroleum product prices in December 1997 after the effective fall of the Gujarat government, at a time when the price of crude oil was about $10 a barrel. And that system was able to last only till the price of crude oil crossed about $20 a barrel in 2003, when the very government that boasted that it was running deregulated prices then found itself obliged to regulate them. Today, that same barrel of crude is selling at about $110, $115 a barrel. And the value of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar has also fallen dramatically compared to what it was in 1997. Now, in these circumstances, to suggest that fuel subsidies should be phased out or that other subsidies should be given up betrays a mindset which, in my view, is anti-people. For the one subsidy that Mr. Ramesh has made no comment about is the subsidies which we are giving to the rich. In the last year, that is the year 2011-12, more than 2 lakh crore rupees amounted to taxes, direct taxes forgone. Direct taxes forgone. The richest of the rich were told keep 2.5 lakh crore in your pocket. And they're objecting to a total of 2 lakh crores of subsidies. Is meaningless. And equally, we have to recognize that the model of growth adopted by Mr. Ramesh and those who belong to his view of thinking has resulted in very fast growth, but very wide, very fast widening inequalities. Inequality in urban India, according to the latest NSSO figures, has doubled from a Gini coefficient of about 0.32 to a Gini coefficient of 0.65.
Right, sir, right.
So in these circumstances, where 80% of our people are not the beneficiaries of the growth process, but are suffering the consequences of the inflation generated by high growth,
right, sir,
I think it's extremely irresponsible to talk of getting rid of subsidies.
Well, fair point, sir. Point taken.
Subsidies. We need to target them better.
Absolutely. We'll get to the targeting of the subsidies in just a bit. I'd like to get Nalin S. Kohli into the argument, into the discussion, I beg your pardon. Nalin, you were on the show last week as well, and we talked about this a little bit. Petrol has been hiked, but no signs till now of the government even going near diesel and kerosene and LPG. How long can the government afford to ignore diesel and LPG, regardless of what the school of thought that is led by Mr. Aiyar says, that cutting subsidies is not the way forward. That's not really what the government should be doing. But how long can the government afford not to touch deregulation of diesel?
I'd like to make a few comments, Athar. I think the first one is it's fascinating to watch and listen, in fact, here, to listen to Mr. Shankar Aiyar's statements, which are completely contrary to what Mr. Jairam Ramesh has said, and he's flatly, of course, opposing them. So it raises a question whether this is a government and a party at war with each other, and that's the ruling dispensation in
that's
the country,
not what we're discussing,
or
sir.
is it duplicity at its best? Okay. No, I'm just making this point because the issue here, when you're bringing up, and also Mr. Mani Shankar Aiyar brought in the point of the 1997, 2003. I think the question of subsidies, when you have to look at, and I'm going to come to all of these points one by one. When you look at the issue of subsidies, I think the first point here is it has to be looked at in a context. First is subsidies are definitely meant to benefit only certain sections of society and not for all. That's one. Two is, I think the issue of subsidies is basically the result of how a government decides to manage its resources. And in a government which has gone for increased expenditure without looking at the overall way of managing the economy, where the revenues would come from, would find itself at the receiving end of this question. And that's obvious when you have the fiscal deficit at 5 lakh crores. So when a government has brought the fiscal deficit up from about 4.6%, which was its own estimate, to about 6%, and is faced with such a huge fiscal deficit, with a deficit on both the current and the capital account, in such a scenario, the government's hands is rather tied and it does not have much options. And the logical option in such a scenario could have been reduction of taxes. Tapan has also referred to this in great detail. So when you can't reduce taxes on one hand, therefore you have stress. The second part is when we are looking at diesel specifically, and I'll talk about it a little in detail.
Briefly, sir, if you could, I need to go back to Tapan.
Is used not only for transportation. Yes, 1 minute. On subsidy, diesel subsidy issue becomes a very sensitive issue because diesel is also used in the farming community in terms of gensets, in terms of tractors. It's not just for movement. And movement in terms of road transportation, which is essentially bus services, to a large extent even trains, are run on diesel. I mean, besides the SUVs, which contribute probably to a small percentage, and maybe there is an argument there. But then the next point that comes in a country where a generation of power is suffering, where you don't have adequate power, you're forced to run factories, which is industrial, and you are forced to run also, the farming community is forced to depend on diesel for its own generation of power. And in that context, if you're going to start looking at this question, in a case where you already have declining industrial index, in the IIP.
Right.
In a case which has gone down from 8.5% to minus
Right.
3.5%.
Nalin,
I mean, this question is larger. It's not just about a simple statement.
Nalin, let me go to Tapanda and pick up a point what Mr. Aiyar just said. Jairam Ramesh has also said, Tapanda, that subsidy should only be given to those families which are poor and for whom it is important. He's also said that there were many in the country who are getting subsidies, subsidy benefits without really needing them. Do you agree with the view that we are subsidizing the rich, like Mr. Jairam Ramesh had said, instead of those who really need it? Bear in mind, an LPG cylinder has a subsidy of over 500 rupees on every cylinder. Do you agree with Mr. Ramesh when he says we are subsidizing the rich and not really those who need it?
I agree with the statement of Mr. Ramesh, but not his view. Yes, this government, UPA 2 government, is basically subsidizing the rich. That this UPA 2 government is lamenting over a fiscal deficit of over 5 lakh crore, and at the same time the same government is giving that when annual tax foregone to the tune of 5.2 lakh crore, not collecting the tax, direct tax, year after year, more than 3 lakh crores. So, rather it is a patronized tax default. So, I believe that at every step of this government's economic policy paradigm is designed to subsidize the rich. And on petrol and diesel and kerosene, whatever they are claiming, again I reiterate my statement, they are not at all subsidizing. Whatever they are giving in the name of subsidy, more than 3 times they are extracting in the form of tax. So, they cannot make any claim. And secondly, when just my previous speaker spoke about diesel, yes, diesel basically on public transport, if they think of withdrawing subsidy from there, straightway they are making the public transport costly. But at the same time, despite having been pointed out in specific terms in the floor of the House that why the foreign and domestic mobile telecom companies should be allowed to consume subsidized diesel to run their mobile towers, whether government should consider not to allow them to avail that, government just kept mum.
Right, sir.
Because they don't want to touch them at all.
Right, fair point, sir, fair point.
Because
let me get Mr. Aiyar again.
So, here clearly the priorities of the government, one, whatever statement they are making, they are just befooling the people. They are considering the people are all fools. But in reality, they are subsidizing the rich and they are sucking out the poor.
Right. Tapanda, let me go back to Nalin Kohli for a bit and ask Nalin this. Nalin, the finance minister obviously has been under a lot of pressure to cut subsidies for a while now. He has suggested during this recent parliamentary session a 3-pronged plan of action. He proposed, number 1 was duty cuts by the states, then duty cuts by the centre, and third, the consumers taking on part of that burden. Now, we've already seen the consumers taking a hit by the petrol price hike, but is that the 3-pronged attack suggested by the finance minister the right way of going about it, or do you see another way that could have been devised?
Well, I think the finance minister's task is tough, and it's basically because of the doing of the government itself. This government has been in power or has been at the center for about 8 years. And it inherited not a sagging economy, but an economy of surpluses. And today we have a sagging economy. Now, it's easy to blame international, the 2000, you can start saying that Europe is declining. There's a crisis in Europe, but there was also a crisis in 2008. There was a crisis in 1997, the Asian crisis. There was also a crisis after the after Pokhran, when you had sanctions. So India has weathered that storm. But India has weathered that storm because essentially our fundamentals have been strengthened or had been strengthened. And basically domestic demand was also strong, driven by domestic consumption and demand. Now what's happened is in these 8 years, you've had an economy which is now moving to a dangerous or a red zone. And every parameter, and even the rupee depreciation that Mr. Aiyar referred to, is inexplicable because nowhere in Asia is this kind of crisis being seen in other currencies by the tune of 25%.
Right.
So I think the question is the finance minister has very little space to maneuver. So what choice would he have but to start talking of the bitter pill? But the question to be asked is, why do we need the bitter pill in the first place? The cause of the disease is because of mismanagement of the economy.
Nalin, we'll let Mr. Aiyar respond to that, but after a small break, don't go anywhere, keep watching The Big Picture. We'll come back with Shankar Aiyar's response. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're still watching The Big Picture. If I could go straight to Mr. Shankar Aiyar again. Mr. Aiyar, you heard what Mr. Nalin Kohli had to say just briefly before the break. Let me add another question to that. Is there an alternative to cutting subsidies or is there an alternative to subsidies per se that the government can explore? Is there a way of helping those in need with assistance without spending thousands of crores on subsidies? Any programs or schemes that the government could perhaps explore in the near future? You've been a former petroleum minister. You'd have a better idea.
I'm afraid I'm at a disadvantage because your technical people collapsed and I was off the air for several minutes, so I don't know the totality of the argument.
I'll try and answer the question
but
I just asked
to
you.
answer your question in itself.
If I could repeat the question for you, sir.
To answer the question that you posed me.
Yeah,
you said the question, I've heard it.
So you...
No, can I answer your question?
Absolutely, yes. Go ahead, sir.
What are the subsidies you're talking of? The subsidies to the poor or the subsidies to the rich? The subsidies to the rich are called stimulus. And in the last 5 years, stimulus to the extent of 21 lakh crore rupees has been given largely to the better off and the obscenely rich sections of Indian society. We can easily bear the subsidy burden if we up our revenues by insisting that the kind of tax concessions that have been given over the last 5 years now be withdrawn. Then there would be no burden. The burden is arising out of the fact that we are combining massive subsidies to the rich in the shape of about 2.5 lakh crores of concessions on direct taxes with about like amount in indirect taxes. And as against that, the total subsidy bill is only 2 lakh crore. So if you increase the revenues, then there would be no burden. And I think it's absurd to be against subsidies in a country which has as many poor people as we have. Therefore, subsidies have never been a Congress disease. In all the governments that we have had, Congress and non-Congress, there's always been subsidies, and the subsidy burden has been steadily increasing. And that is because we have to protect the poor. And if we don't, then our democracy is in danger.
Right.
So the question of getting rid of subsidies is is just not there.
Right.
What you can do is to better organize the subsidies, but that is a separate question.
Right.
And when it comes to my friend Mr. Chopin Sen saying that from petroleum we got so many revenues, of course we get large revenues, but these revenues are not meant just to subsidize petroleum products. They are for the growth of the economy. And that is why state governments, who also raise a huge proportion of their total revenues from petroleum and from petroleum products, are loath to cut those.
Right.
The basis on which we should go, insofar as fuel subsidies, may I finish?
Yeah,
insofar as the fuel subsidies are concerned, is on the principle that I adumbrated as Minister of Petroleum, which is equitable burden sharing. If you have to increase prices by 1 rupee, before you do that, see how many paise can be taken by the upstream companies. Then see how many paise can be taken by the downstream companies. Then see how many paise can be cut from import duties. Then see how many paise can be cut from excise duties.
Right, sir.
Then you turn to these selfish state governments. Ask them also to contribute to this exercise, and then it's only the few remaining paise.
Let Tapan respond to that, sir, if you could. Let Tapan respond to that.
You cannot have a situation in which crude oil prices go from $10 in 1997 to $115 now and not expect any rise in even the regulated petroleum
Mr. Aiyar, let Tapan respond to that. Tapan, you agree with Mr. Aiyar when he says that getting rid of subsidies is really not something the path we should take right now. That's out of the question for the government, but a better implementation of these subsidies is what's required.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with the basic philosophy espoused by Mr. Shankar Aiyar in the matter of subsidy in our country, and at the same time, to better organizing it. And on this respect, I like to just to draw your attention that the present petroleum price hike, the mainly villain was, as has been claimed, is that rupee-dollar relationship has gone worse against the rupee.
Right.
But at the same time, we must note that it is not an unalloyed problem of loss. There are areas within the petroleum sector who gain unduly because of this rupee depreciation in terms of dollar. Those who are exporting the petroleum from our country, they are gaining. The import duty account of the government is earning a fortune because the rupee dollar relationship is going change. So the area where you are gaining out of the rupee depreciation in terms of dollar, you can very well not allow to get some undue, to flow such undue gain. If you contain, I think you need not to burden the people of the country because of rupee depreciation in terms of dollar and its impact on the petroleum. And secondly, I find in the screen you are showing the under-recoveries. What do you mean by these under-recoveries? Under-recoveries are not loss. Despite such under-recovery, the petroleum companies are earning profit. Under-recovery is a notional amount. The price, the profit, the margin which you could have earned, you could not earn because of this change in the prices. That is what is under-recovery. It is not a loss. But the manner it is being projected by the government, the ministers, just to be fooling the people, as if everything is going down the drain.
Right.
And thirdly, my last point in this respect, you must take note into account that I reiterate that point, that no product of which the price, the tax component is 47%, is not at all a healthier sign or not at all a proper, prudent taxation management.
Right.
That does not speak up.
Tapan, I have to get Nalin Kohli in at this point. Nalin, if you can hear me, let's get a little away from fuel subsidies per se. Let's talk about other subsidies that the government is giving out. Subsidies to farmers, agriculture subsidy, there's the food security bill coming up as well. Now, there is a view going around that the food security act will lead to wasteful piling up of food subsidies without any concomitant gains in food distribution. The same school of thought says that delay the implementation of the FSB, which is the food security bill, till a more efficient system of distribution is in place. Where do you and your party stand on the food subsidy bill?
See, I think the point that you have to look at is, and it's the macro picture, is that when you're talking about giving benefit to the poor sections of society, and I think there's no debate here, that's a complete acceptable, that you have to help the weaker sections of society. And I think that's across the political spectrum. But the point here is, when you're planning it, you have to think it through, and that's the responsibility of the government in terms of not only distribution, which is an important point, it's also about where will the funds come from. And when basically an economy which is growing, an economy which is not in the red, an economy that is generating new sources of income and revenue, is an economy that can pick up a burden of even an increased subsidy. That's not a problem. In the West, you might know that agriculture is subsidized in places like Europe to the tune of 100%,
right,
if not more. So, I mean, it's not as if subsidy or subsidization is something unique to India. It's a point and it's a national imperative that you would look at in the larger interests of, say, in Europe, it would be in food security. So now let's come back to the question here. And I raised it earlier and it comes back again. The question here is that why are we talking of the bitter pill today? The question that needs to be discussed is, why are we in this situation and what has brought us to this point that today the economy is not able to sustain it? Mr. Aiyar speaks about $10 and he speaks about today $114. That's reality. But I would also like to bring to Mr. Aiyar's notice that during the 6 years of the NDA, when we were in government, we had taken growth not only to 8.4%, but we had increased, for example, foreign exchange reserves by 4 times. Everything, the fiscal deficit was in control. So there was a possibility that you could increase these kind of allocations for the poor. In 8 years of economic management, what has happened is, essentially, this government has increased its social sector spending without putting in place the revenues or not come. For another example would be that while the taxpayers base was taken up to about 3 crore people or 30 million up to the 2004 under Mr. Yashwant Sinha and later Mr. Jaswant Singh as finance ministers, that tax base in 8 years remains the same, virtually. So, I mean, the question here is about overall macro management of the economy. Subsidies is one part of it.
Right. Nalin, let me give the last word on the show to Mr. Aiyar. Sir, we have not much time left. Let me ask you this. You heard what Nalin Kohli said. Is it a case of economic mismanagement completely, or is it something else? And my question to you, sir, last question on the show would be, what about other loss-making units? Say, for example, Air India. Has the time come for Air India to be put up for private management or even sale to shore up the government finances so as to mobilize funds that the government desperately needs? Mr. Aiyar.
I can't let you protect Mr. Kohli from talking the rubbish that he's just spoken.
Please respond to him, sir.
The NDA's management of the economy was so poor that our GDP growth rate through 3 of the 5 years was down at 2, 3, 4%. And it was only in the last year that they moved up to 8.3. And he talks about us being in the red. That is nonsense. We are growing at nearly 7% per annum, which is just about the second highest rate of growth of any large non-oil economy in the world. So his talk about economic mismanagement is pure politics. It has nothing to do with economics.
Right, sir.
As for Air India, I believe we need a national carrier. I believe it should be better managed. I do believe that a lot of the money that has been invested in it has gone waste. But I also see that any number of private airlines have also swallowed the nation's capital in running the business badly. And all I can say is, so long as we cut our coat according to the cloth available, which means concentrating Air India on revenue-making routes and on revenue-making sections of our population, which is the poor, the laborers who go to the Gulf, and those lower middle-class families who are now traveling by air, instead of having this Vijay Mallya syndrome affect us. I'm sure that Air India can be brought back on track.
On that note, Mr. Aiyar, we have to wind up the show. We're completely out of time. Of course, Mr. Aiyar and Mr. Nalin Kohli not really agreeing. No surprises there. Tapan, also, thank you for joining us on the show, Mr. Aiyar as well as Mr. Kohli. Of course, what came out of today's show was perhaps one clear point that I'd like to reiterate right now, that it's not that cutting subsidies is going to take us to where we want overnight. Perhaps a better implementation of and better distribution of those subsidies is what the government should be looking at. That's all the time we have from the Big Picture tonight. Till next time, and we get you another hot issue and another eminent panel. This is Athar Khan saying goodbye and thank you for watching.